Did Jesus of Nazareth rise from the dead? How do we know? Our best sources for telling us this are the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, before someone in the comment section says, oh boy, he's about to quote the Bible to prove the Bible, just like the fundamentalist he is, allow me to get this misconception out of the way. I will be using the Gospels, I will be citing them, but not as inspired scripture. In other words, I won't quote a Bible verse that says Jesus rose from the dead and then say, the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it. Hallelujah. Rather, I will treat the Gospels as merely ancient biographies. They are ancient documents that claim to be able to tell us about this man named Jesus of Nazareth. And then I will scrutinize their testimony, just as we would with the Roman lives of the Roman emperors written by Plutarch or other ancient biographies. It's just historiography. We're just using documents that are widely considered to be inspired by a lot of people, including myself, but I won't be using that preconception in my case. Now, first, I want to make a quick case for the traditional authorship of the Gospels. There is a lot of evidence that the tax collector Matthew wrote Matthew, that Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark, and that he got his information from Peter, and so on. In fact, I have a 2-hour podcast on this topic that's going up on the Cerebral Faith podcast this Saturday. But the only evidence I'm going to record here, because it's TikTok, short form content, is the manuscript evidence. Now, Eric Manning of Testify says, quote, first of all, there are no anonymous copies of the four Gospels. Zero, zilch, nada. Every single shred of manuscript evidence we have attributes them to the traditional authors. While there is a slight variation in how they're titled, the familiar names are all there. These go back to the most ancient copies that we possess in our hands right now. There's no historical evidence that the originals had no titles, end quote. And here on Eric Manning's blog, you can see the gospel titles, the earliest manuscript, and the estimated date. The Gospel according to Matthew, Papyrus 4, 2nd century. Gospel according to Matthew, Papyrus 62, 2nd century. Gospel according to Matthew, Codex Sinaiticus, 4th century. According to Matthew, both from the 4th century. You can pause to look at this whole list if you want to, but while the titles do vary, some say either the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, or just according to Matthew, according to Mark, or just simply Matthew, or just simply Mark. They all of the manuscripts that we have all agree that these four authors wrote these works. Now, if you want to look at a true case of anonymous authorship, Brant Petrie gives us one in his book, The Case for Jesus, which is where Eric Manning got his manuscript list from. You can pause this to look at this if you want to, but some people attribute the Hebrews to Paul. Some people attribute it to Timothy. Some just say to the Hebrews. But there is no dispute in the early church, in the first few centuries, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, why am I going into all of this? This just scratches. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Again, I have a 2-hour podcast going in really deep into the weeds. Lots of positive evidence for traditional authorship. But why is traditional authorship important for a case for the resurrection? Well, if you're using a maximal data argument, which is what I'm using in this TikTok, then what we have here are eyewitness testimonies. The tax collector Matthew, who followed Jesus around for 3 years. John, the son of Zebedee, who followed Jesus around for several years. Mark, although he wasn't an eyewitness, he got his eyewitness from Peter, the Apostle Peter. The one who, if you're a Catholic, he was the first pope, but he was at least one of Jesus's inner three. So these are eyewitness testimonies. They were there. So what do the eyewitnesses say? Well, there's no question of what their testimonies are. All you have to do is open your Bibles and read them. They claimed that Jesus died on the cross and that he got up and he appeared to them and his tomb was found empty, and he did very physical things like eating fish, and he invited Thomas to touch his crucifixion wounds, his hands and his side. And he spent 40 days with his disciples. He appeared to multiple people, indoors and outdoors, to hard-hearted people like Peter, and soft-hearted people like Mary. Why did they report these things? Well, there are three options. Uh, They were either lying, they were mistaken, or they were telling the truth. This is where what I call the Magruian trilemma. This is the Magruian trilemma. This is where this comes in. It's a syllogism formulated by the philosopher Lydia Magru, and it goes like this. Premise one, the gospel authors were either lying, mistaken, or telling the truth. Premise two, they were not lying or mistaken. Conclusion, therefore they were telling the truth. This is a logically valid syllogism. The conclusion follows from the premises by the rule of disjunctive syllogism. Now, the first premise is indisputable. It's just a list of possible explanations. How could you dispute a list? Now, it's really the second premise where the debate is going to lie, unless, of course, you want to debate and dispute whether these are eyewitness testimonies, which we can debate that too. But if you accept that these are eyewitness testimonies, as the overwhelming historical evidence shows, then this is where the debate is going to lie, that the eyewitnesses are either making up tall tales or they were just somehow mistaken. There are several theories. First, let's get the lying option out of the way. There are many reasons to believe that the gospel authors were not lying, but the quickest to list is the evidence that they were all martyred. Now, some of the martyrdoms are better attested than others. Peter's is best attested. Sean McDowell wrote an entire scholarly book called The Fate of the Apostles, looking at the evidence. But I think there's a high probability that even for Matthew, um, Matthew was most likely martyred. And John, although a lot of people believe he wasn't martyred, but he died of old age on the island of Patmos, nevertheless, he did risk martyrdom. In the book of Acts, John's brother James was beheaded on the order of Herod Agrippa. So James had to have known that he was playing with hot water. Now, why is this important? Because liars make poor martyrs. People will die for a lie that they think is the truth, but no one will die for a lie that they know is a lie. If they were lying, if they were just making up tall tales, Matthew and John and Peter were just like, hey, let's just write some books about our dead rabbi and say that he came back from the dead and did all these wonderful things. Um, why would Matthew make up tall tales and then get himself unalived for those tall tales? Why would John make up tall tales and at least face a pretty hard life for those tall tales? Why would Peter make up tall tales, give that information to Mark, and then go get himself crucified upside down for those tall tales? If they were lying, don't you think they would have recanted before they got killed? The lying option is just not tenable. Now, what about the mistaken category? Now, we could spend a lot of time on this option. There's many, many, many naturalistic theories that try to account for how the disciples, the gospel authors, could have sincerely believed that Jesus rose from the dead, but they were mistaken somehow. But I don't have time to get into all of those. Maybe we can get into those in the comment section if some of you would like to raise some of those possibilities. But the most common naturalistic explanation is the hallucination theory, that they hallucinated seeing the risen Jesus, but he wasn't really there. The problem with this explanation is that hallucinations are conjured up by the individual's minds. They're like dreams in this way. They can't be shared experiences. Multiple groups of people on multiple different occasions saw Jesus at the same time. Groups of people all saw Jesus at the same time. And they all saw him doing and saying very physical things like eating fish and inviting his disciples to touch him to see that he wasn't a ghost. He didn't just appear to one group of people on one specific occasion, but to multiple groups on multiple different occasions, indoors and outdoors, to hard-headed people and soft-hearted people like Thomas and Mary. In one of my blog articles, I have an entire list of all of the appearances, and you can pause the video to look at this if you want to. Are all of these people going to have the same hallucination of a dead person? I don't think so. Not to mention, what happened to the empty tomb? Why is the body gone? So I don't think the lying option or the mistaken option are very good. So let's examine the syllogism again. 1. The gospel authors were either lying, mistaken, or telling the truth. 2. They were not lying or mistaken. 3. Therefore, they were telling the truth. I don't understand the question. The Gospels do come from the first century. Even skeptical non-Christian scholars will tell you that. Ask Bart Ehrman or Gerhard Ludemann. Now, the debate is not what century the Gospels were written in, but what decade. With the more conservative dating being the mid 40s to early 60s, and the more liberal dating being Matthew being written in Matthew and Mark being written in the mid 60s, and then John being written in Luke being written after 70, John in the 90s. I would favor the earlier dating, and there are a couple of reasons. There are several reasons for that. I've got a whole blog article on that on my website, and there's also going to be a podcast episode about it coming out soon on the Cerebral Faith podcast that goes into much more detail than the short TikTok. But one reason is that we know that the Book of Acts and the author who wrote Luke's Gospel, they're the same person. How do we know? Well, in Luke chapter 1, Luke says that he is writing for the sake of Theophilus. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4, quote, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught." You turn over to Acts chapter 1, we read this. "In the first book, O Theophilus, I have dealt with all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day when he was taken up. After he had given commands through the Holy Spirit to the apostles whom he had chosen, he presented himself alive to them after his sufferings by many proof, etc., etc., etc." So he says, in my former book, or in the first book, depending on the translation, the author says, I wrote about all the things that Jesus said and did until the day he was taken up. Now, given the evidence for Lucan authorship, of which I barely even scratched the surface in my first TikTok, I just looked at the manuscript evidence. I didn't even look at things like external attestations to Lucan authorship from the early church fathers, or the internal evidence showing that the author of the Gospel of Luke has a physician's perspective. But given that, most scholars, whether they think Luke wrote Luke or not, they have the same author. Now, here's the thing. The book of Acts reads like a TV show that got canceled due to bad ratings. You follow the development of the early church, Peter and Paul, and, and all of the things they did, all the acts of the apostles. And then Paul gets arrested, and he appeals to Caesar, but then you don't know what happens to him. The book just ends. Does Paul go to Rome? What happens at his trial? We don't find out from the book of Acts. The book of Acts also doesn't record the crucifixion of Peter. We have to go to extra biblical sources to find that out. Now, according to extra biblical sources, Paul and Peter were martyred in the 60s AD under Nero's reign. Paul was beheaded, Peter was crucified about 62 to 64 AD. This means the book of Acts was probably written before this, because if it was written after this, look, Peter and Paul were like the two main characters. Peter was like the main character for the first few chapters, and then Paul, it was just Paul after that. Don't you think that the author would have wanted to tell his readers what happened to the major characters in the book? There's no mention of the Neronic persecution. The Emperor Nero persecuted Christians en masse, according to Josephus and Tacitus, and I mean he was lighting them on fire and nailing them to crosses to light his gardens. For a book that's devoted to the development of the early church, that seems like it would be included if it was written after this occurred, and yet it's not. So the best explanation is that Acts was written in 62 AD at the latest, the absolute latest. Well, this means that the Gospel of Luke had to have been written before, because we've already established that Luke came before Acts. It's the author is referring to his previous work. Well, at least a year. And then, since the so-called synoptic problem, Luke and Matthew, Luke uses some material. They use a lot of material from Mark. That means that Mark had to have been written even earlier, at least a year. But I don't think it's very plausible to think that Gospels are coming out every single year like Marvel movies. So it was probably several years. This was in the day and age before FedEx trucks were invented. So probably, around 5 or 6 years. And that would put Matthew in the, around the mid-50s, and then maybe Mark in the late 40s. This is just 10 to 20 years after the death of Jesus. It's very early, and I think these and other arguments for early dating are very good. Now, as for who the 500 people were that Paul mentions, for those who don't know, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, which is a very early creed that actually predates the Gospels, we don't know who these 500 people were. And frankly, insofar as this specific argument I'm using for the resurrection, it's not really relevant. I didn't actually appeal to Paul. I don't rely on Paul in a maximal data argument nearly as heavily as I do in a minimal facts approach. Now, I can bring Paul in as a witness if need be. One of the cool things about a maximal data argument is that you're not limited to what kinds of evidence you want to use, like with a minimal facts argument, where you have to use data that meets scholarly consensus and has at least 10 different arguments in their favor. In a maximal data argument, you can use whatever you want as long as you think it's a good argument. But yeah, I don't know who these 500 people were. I just don't, but I don't see how that's relevant to the argument I'm trying to give here. Athanasius's comment says, "Is there anywhere in the Gospels where the authors say anything like, I, blank, saw the resurrected Jesus?" I have a feeling I think I know what you're trying to get at with this comment. I'm not sure. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But this sounds like the argument that, well, Matthew couldn't have written the Gospel of Matthew, for example, because he spoke in the third person, or John, the son of Zebedee, could have written the Gospel of John because John never refers to himself in the third person, rather referring to himself in terms like the beloved disciple, or the disciple whom Jesus loved. And it is true that the gospel authors do refer to themselves in the third person. For example, in Matthew chapter 9, verse 9, we read, "As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. 'Follow me,' he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him." But this really isn't a good argument against the traditional authorship of the Gospels. The traditional authorship of the Gospels was not doubted by anyone, even skeptics and opponents of Christianity, for the first 400 years of the church's existence. Now, when somebody did try to argue against, say, Matthean authorship, St. Augustine responded as follows. Quote, "Faustus thinks himself wonderfully clever in proving that Matthew was not the writer of this gospel, because when speaking of his own election, he says not, 'He saw me and said to me, follow me,' but 'He saw him and said to him, follow me.' This must have been said either in ignorance or from a design to mislead. Faustus can hardly be so ignorant as to not have read or heard that narrators, when speaking of themselves, often use a construction as if speaking of another. It is more probable that Faustus wished to bewilder those more ignorant than himself, in the hope of getting hold on not a few unacquainted with these things. It is needless to resort to other writings to quote examples of this construction from profane authors for the information of our friends and for the refutations of Faustus." End quote. Now, even though St. Augustine says he sees no need to quote these other authors, I will. In Josephus's Jewish War, Book 3, Chapter 8, Part 7, we read, quote, "However, in this extreme distress, he was not destitute of his usual sagacity, but trusting himself to the providence of God, he put his life into hazard." End quote. Now, the him that Josephus is referring to is Josephus. Flavius Josephus is referring to himself in the third person in the Jewish wars. In Xenophon's work, Anabasis, we read, quote, "There was a man in the army named Xenophon, an Athenian," end quote. Xenophon is referring to himself in the third person. Now, in John chapter 21, we do have it still written in the third person, but it is a claim that the author of the Gospels was with the risen Jesus. Start in verse 20. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who had also leaned back against him during the supper and had said, "Lord, who is it that is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, "Lord, what about this man?" Jesus said to him, "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me." So the saying spread abroad among the brothers that this disciple was not to die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he was not to die. But if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? This is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things, and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. Athanasius' comment says, like, after so many decades, how would the church fathers even know? That is, know that Matthew wrote Matthew, John wrote John, etc. That weren't they just taking people's word for it? The problem is that this really doesn't understand who the church fathers were, or that there is this unbroken chain of custody. For example, the church father Papias lived from 60 to 130 AD. He personally knew the Apostle John and was a companion of Polycarp. Polycarp was also a disciple of John. He was a disciple of one of the disciples. Like Polycarp, he was one of the Apostle John's students. He's in a great position to know whether or not John wrote John, or whether Matthew wrote Matthew, because if he knew John, he undoubtedly would have spoken to Matthew at some point. And Irenaeus, who lived from AD 130 to 202 AD, he also personally knew Polycarp. In fact, he was ordained by him to be the bishop of Smyrna. He testifies that Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew. Clement of Alexandria, who lived from 150 to 215, he wrote, quote, "Matthew published his gospel among the Hebrews in their own language, while Peter and Paul were preaching and founding the church in Rome," end quote. Origen, who lived from 185 to 253 AD, wrote, quote, "Among the four Gospels, which are the only indisputable ones in the Church of God under heaven, I have learned by tradition that the first was written by Matthew, who was once a publican, but afterwards an apostle of Jesus Christ, and it was prepared for the converts from Judaism." So multiple people, some of whom were extremely close in time and personally knew the disciples, testified to the authorship of those books. And in this case, it's talking about Matthew's gospel. In the case of Matthean authorship, so far we have two independent witnesses. Papias said Matthew wrote Matthew, and Irenaeus says Matthew wrote Matthew. Not only that, but these authors knew the gospel authors. Let's assume, here's a thought experiment. Let's assume that we have a biography by Donald Trump written by an author who doesn't name himself in the work. The front page is devoid of his name, and he doesn't tell us anywhere in the work that he wrote the book. But let's say that a man named Bob Bobertson writes a news article and he attributes the life of Donald Trump to Sam Sampson. And he says Sam was the one who wrote the biography. Since Bob knew Sam, he knew Sam personally, and since Bob was living in the United States of America, he would be in a pretty good position to know this. But let's suppose that we have another author, Richard Richardson. He also writes a news article saying that Sam Sampson is the author of Trump's biography. So, what are the odds that both of these men who knew Sam Sampson and they were in that area at the time, that they're both independently lying? It's not very high. And these are just four citations. I could go on, but let me just say this. Everyone who commented on the authorship of the Gospels are all unanimous in attributing the Gospel of Matthew to Matthew. There is no one who attributes Matthew to Paul or Peter or Philip. Um, from our earliest sources, Papias and Irenaeus, to our latest sources, Clement and Origen, they all agree. Now, regarding Johannine authorship, specifically, Irenaeus of Lyons says, quote, "Further, they teach that John, the disciple of the Lord, indicated the first Ogdode, expressing themselves in these words: John, the disciple of the Lord, wishing to set forth the origin of all things, so as to explain how the Father produced the whole, lays down a certain principle, namely, which was first begotten by God, which being he has termed both the only begotten Son and God, in whom the Father, after a similar manner, brought forth all things," end quote. Peter, having preached the word publicly at Rome, and by the Spirit proclaimed the gospel, those who were present, who were numerous, enumerated Mark, inasmuch as he attended him from an early period, and remembered what he had been said, to write down what had been spoken. On his composing the gospel, he handed it to those who had made the request to him, which coming to Peter's knowledge, he neither hindered nor encouraged. But John, last of all, seeing that what was corporeal was set forth in the Gospels, on the entreaty of his intimate friends, and inspired by the Spirit, composed a spiritual gospel. End quote. And Ignatius of Antioch writes, quote, "Wherefore with great alacrity and joy, through his desire to suffer, he came down from Antioch to Seleucia, from which place he set sail. And after a great deal of suffering, he came to Smyrna, where he disembarked with great joy, and hastened to see the holy Polycarp, formerly his fellow disciple, and now bishop of Smyrna. For they had both in old times been disciple of St. John the Apostle, being then brought to him, and having communicated to him some spiritual gifts, and glorifying in his bonds, he entreated of him to labor along with him for the fulfillment of his desire, earnestly indeed, asking this of the whole church, for the cities and churches of Asia had welcomed the holy man through their bishops and presbyters and deacons, all hastening to meet him, if by any means they might receive from him some spiritual gift. But above all, the holy Polycarp, that by means of wild beasts he soon disappearing from this world might be manifested before the face of Christ." Regarding the Gospel of Luke, Irenaeus of Lyons says, quote, "Luke, also the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him," end quote. So again, as you can see, Irenaeus and Polycarp, or Irenaeus and Ignatius, are our most valuable sources because they are the closest in time. Here are also some quotes about the traditional authorship of Mark from a PowerPoint I was going to use for a live stream, but decided not to because I switched the podcast back to being audio only. And you can pause the video to read some of these quotes if you want to. I think they're readable from the viewfinder. But yeah, the evidence from the church fathers is pretty strong. And in my article, I didn't even bring out the manuscript evidence in my long essay on the blog. I just stuck to the church father evidence. But there's also internal evidence that I could talk about in another TikTok. But I'm going on 8 minutes here, so I think I'm just going to cut it off. The internal evidence for traditional authorship on its own, I don't think is very strong, but I do think it supplements the already strong case from outside of the Gospels, the manuscript evidence, and all that the church fathers have to say. So when you look at the internal evidence, you're like, yeah, this is consistent with what a tax collector would write. This is consistent with what a doctor would write. This is consistent with what a fisherman would write, and we can get into that if you'd like. What would the Gospels look like if they were stories passed around for a few years and then later attributed by the apostles, by educated Greek scribes? All right, well, this gives me a great excuse to go into the internal evidence for traditional authorship, whereas in the previous TikTok, I responded to another comment of yours, Athanasius's, in which I looked at the external evidence from the church fathers, some of whom were they were personally acquainted with the apostles, and they wouldn't be in the position to know. But one piece of evidence for Markan authorship, that is Mark. Um, well, there's actually several. This piece of artwork was made by J. Warner Wallace, and I got it from his book Cold Case Christianity, a homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. It's a very good book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. These are some of the internal pieces of evidence that he mentions. There are features in the Gospel of Mark that strongly hint at Peter being the source of the information. Um, as we saw in the previous TikTok response video rather, early church testimony was unanimous that Mark's gospel was actually, in a sense, Peter's gospel. 1. Mark mentioned Peter with prominence. Peter is featured frequently in Mark's gospel. He referred to him 26 times in his gospel. Matthew only referred to Peter 3 additional times in his much longer gospel. Second, Mark identified Peter with the most familiarity. Mark is the only writer who never once used the term Simon Peter. He uses the word Simon and Peter, but never Simon Peter. This may seem like a silly and frivolous thing to point out, but not when you consider that Simon and Peter were the most popular male names in first century Palestine. Mark never makes an effort to distinguish between the Apostle Simon with the boatloads of other Simons running around. Compare this to John's referring of the Apostle as Simon Peter 17 times. 3. Mark used Peter as a set of bookends. In his book, Cold Case Christianity, which again is where I got this graphic from, J. Warner Wallace points out that out of the 12 disciples, Mark identifies Peter first, Mark chapter 1, verse 16, and he mentions him last at the very end of his gospel, Mark chapter 16, verse 7. Wallace said that scholars describe this as inclusio, and notice the same thing occurring in other ancient writings where the document is attributed to an individual. In these other ancient writings, it was the individual being bookended who was the one who wrote the thing. So if you have a document and that is ascribed to Plato, and Plato shows up first in the narrative, and then he shows up last in the narrative, then Plato wrote the thing. And this is what scholars find over and over again, inclusio, when the author is the one who shows up in the narrative first and last. Fourthly, Mark omitted Peter's embarrassments. If you're writing a biography about someone and you're heavily involved in their life, you'd probably have a tendency to leave unflattering and embarrassing things about yourself out, right? You'd paint yourself in a much gentler light than someone else would. We find Peter painted in the kindest possible way in Mark's gospel. Far kinder than the other 3 Gospels, which recount the same events. For example, while Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 23 calls Peter a doubter and a man of little faith, Mark chapter 6, verse 45 to 52, which records the same event, omits Peter's involvement altogether. Luke 5 records Jesus' miracle of the catching of the fish, in which Peter doubts Jesus' wisdom, yet Mark's parallel account omits Peter's cynicism altogether. Fifthly, Mark mentions details that can be better attributed to Peter. J. Warner Wallace explains, and I quote, Mark alone included a number of seemingly unimportant details that point to Peter's involvement in the shaping of the text. Mark alone told us that Simon and his companions were the ones who went looking for Jesus when he was praying in a solitary place. Mark chapter 1, verses 35 to 37. Mark is also the only gospel to tell us that it was Peter who first drew Jesus' attention to the withered fig tree. Compare Matthew chapter 21, verses 18 to 19 with Mark chapter 11, verses 20 to 21. Mark alone seemed to be able to identify the specific disciples, including Peter, who asked Jesus about the timing of the destruction of the temple. Compare Matthew chapter 24, verses 1 to 3 with Mark chapter 13, verses 1 to 4, end quote. Given this cumulative set of internal pieces of evidence, the best explanation is that Mark really did write Mark and that he did get his information from Peter. This conclusion from internal evidence is made all the more stronger when you put it up next to the extra biblical, the external evidence, the evidence from the manuscripts and the testimonies of the church fathers. Now, when it comes to Matthean authorship, there's some good internal evidence as well. Different people recognize different features of the same event due to their unique personality. So, for example, in my article on the traditional authorship of the Gospels on my website, I give an example in which a friend of mine, me and a friend of mine go to a church, and we describe mostly the same things, but where I mentioned that someone was wearing a Naruto hoodie, someone was wearing a Skillet T-shirt because it was a somewhat informal church, and we sat in the pastor's office before service began because we arrived early, and there were just a lot of good theology books, and as a theology nerd, I just started nerding out. I noticed these details, but my friend Kenneth, he noticed that there were Greg Olson paintings on the walls, and there was the church sanctuary had stained glass windows. But we both agree that on a lot of the same things, but you get some unique details in both of our accounts. So Matthew focuses on the money far more than other gospel authors. For example, only Matthew includes the story of Jesus and Peter paying the 2 drachma tax in Matthew chapter 17, verses 24 to 27. Only Matthew includes the parable of the unmerciful servant in Matthew chapter 18, verses 23 to 35. And only Matthew includes the parable of the vineyard in Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 to 16. Eric Manning of Testify, in his video on the internal evidence for Matthew, did a count. And Matthew mentions money. I can't remember the numbers offhand, but he mentions money way more often than Luke or Mark. And this makes sense because he is a tax collector. We can imagine the parable of the unmerciful servant sticking out to Matthew. In Luke's version of the same story, Luke's version in Luke chapter 17, verses 3 to 4, Luke records Peter coming to Jesus and saying, "Lord, how many times should I forgive my brother in a day? As many as 7 times." And Jesus says, not just 7 times, but 70 times 7 times. That's what Luke records, and Luke just moves on from there. But Matthew, he includes everything that Luke does, but then he goes on to record Jesus telling this lengthy parable about, a man who was forgiven a huge amount of debt, but when he met someone who also owed him money, he refused to show that same mercy. And when the master of the servant found out, he threw the unmerciful servant into prison until he could pay back his debt. As a former tax collector, Matthew would have been well aware about the consequences of what happens when you don't pay your taxes. The Romans were brutal, and we can imagine that, as someone who worked for the hated enemies of the Jews, that Matthew might have a little bit of guilt over this. And so such a story would be very, very vivid in his mind. So what would it look like if it was written other than the names that are ascribed to them? It's hard to say, but I don't think we would have all of these details that are consistent with John Mark getting his information from Peter and writing the Gospel of Mark, and all of these financial details that just make sense if a tax collector really was the one who penned this gospel, the Gospel of Matthew. So you think it's unlikely that they would wait 3 decades to write it down? Why? And how does that refute all of the arguments, both outside of the New Testament and from inside of the New Testament, that the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? How is this not anything but an argument from personal incredulity? And motives? What motives? They had no motives. They had motivations to not write it down, because in writing it down, they got themselves beaten, tortured, and killed. Do I have to go over the martyrdom evidence again? Peter was crucified upside down. It would have been better from a worldly perspective if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John had kept their mouths shut and not wrote anything down and just went about their business and pretended they saw nothing. And also to say that it was just because Irenaeus says so is a gross misrepresentation. It's not just that Irenaeus says so, it's that um, Ignatius says so, and Origen, and all of these other people. And you have the manuscript evidence, again, which you've not touched upon. You've not given any response to the manuscript evidence, and you have the internal evidence that I looked at in a previous TikTok. So let me turn this question back around on you. What motive would people in the early church have to ascribe pseudonymous authorship? I think I said that right. To obscure figures like Mark and Luke. I mean, Luke is only mentioned a couple of times in the Pauline epistles, and Mark, I mean, he's mentioned in Acts a couple of times. Very, very obscure individuals in church history. In fact, the Gospels of Thomas and Peter and Mary, these second, third, and fourth century forgeries, the reason why the forgers chose those names is because they carried a lot of authority. Wow, the Gospel of Mary, either the Mary, the mother of Jesus, or Mary Magdalene, either one, that's pretty good. Thomas, one of the 12, that's pretty good. But Mark and Luke, I mean, even Matthew. Matthew is, everyone agrees, this is the most Jewish gospel because he cites so much messianic prophecy and he knows Jewish customs. I mean, this is a gospel to the Jews. And yet, Matthew was a hated tax collector. He's not exactly someone you would want to ascribe authorship to because he worked for the Romans, who the Jews hated. The only one that makes sense for pseudonymous authorship is John, but none of the other ones. Because John, one of Jesus's inner three, one of the 12, it makes sense. At the other three, I mean, if you were making up names to slap on the Gospels to up their authority, these are just not the kind of names you would choose. I think the best explanation is these men really did write the canonical Gospels. Athanasius's comment is that's a good point. Maybe a major literary tactic in the Gospels is the last shall be first. There are writings attributed to almost every character. So, are you trying to say that because of the philosophy that the least respected should become the most respected, the last shall be first and the first shall be last, that would motivate people to come up with obscure names for pseudonymous authorship? Okay, there's a couple of problems. If that's the case, there's a couple of problems with that. First, that is nothing but a bare possibility. Possibilities come cheap. When it comes to examining historical evidence or just evidence, period, I'm not interested in possibilities. I'm interested in probabilities. Secondly, almost half of the New Testament is ascribed to a major historical person in the church, the Apostle Paul. Most of the epistles in the New Testament are attributed to him, and a lot of these are not disputed by any scholars of any theological stripes, Christians, atheists, agnostics, or whatever, like First and Second Corinthians, Romans. Um, I I think First Thessalonians is not one of the disputed letters. But then you have disputed letters that are also attributed to him, like the pastoral epistles, First and Second Timothy, and so on. Um, you have First and Second John, which is attributed to the Apostle John. Revelation, also attributed to John. Um, the Epistle of James, attributed to Jesus' brother James. So most of the New Testament books outside of the Gospels are actually attributed to major characters that we find in the historical narratives. So I don't think this argument really works. So if you're going to ascribe letters to first and second Peter, if you're going to ascribe that to Peter, why not just why say that Mark wrote it but got his information from Peter? Why not just directly ascribe it to Peter? Say, yeah, Peter wrote the thing. Just cut out the middleman, and the middleman is Mark. Luke and Mark are very obscure individuals. Again, I think it is most likely, and again, Matthew, you're going to make up someone who worked for the hated Romans to be your author to the Jews. I think the best explanation, again, I think it remains that traditional authorship is true. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Athanasius's comment is, what's the probability that Matthew, an eyewitness, would use Mark, not an eyewitness, for his info, not cite him, and narrate in the third person? Well, I've already dealt with the third person issue in another TikTok. That was a video response to you specifically, so if you haven't watched that, I recommend that you go and do so. Actually, I think you have seen it, because if I remember correctly, I think you responded to that. But the issue of Matthew using Mark, who's not an eyewitness. Now, for other viewers of this video who may not know, this deals with the issue of the synoptic problem. The synoptic problem is, okay, you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and Matthew and Luke, they use a lot of material from Mark. It's basically like they took sections of the Gospel of Mark and copy-pasted them into their own gospel. And the problem isn't that, they were sinning by plagiarizing Mark. That really wasn't an issue back then. Everybody did that. It was standard accepted practice. But the problem, the synoptic problem, is who copied who. Was Matthew written first and then Mark and Luke use Matthew, or did Matthew and Luke use Mark? There's like 4 different hypotheses about this, which I'm not going to get into. But Mark in priority. Mark was written first, and then Matthew came after and used material from him rather than the other way around. Matthew was written first, and then Mark came along. Matthean priority versus Mark in priority. Matthean priority is in the minority. Mark in priority is in the majority. So I'm going to respond to, this is an objection to Matthean authorship that, Matthew was an eyewitness and Mark wasn't. So why would he use Mark's material? I'm going to respond to it as though Mark in priority is correct. I think it probably is correct based on what little I've looked into this. But yeah, I don't find it at all improbable that Matthew would use the Gospel of Mark if Mark did use Peter as one of his primary sources, because Peter was one of Jesus's inner 3 and was therefore privy to seeing and hearing things the other disciples didn't. Matthew was not there for every single event in Jesus' life. Indeed, he wasn't even called to be a disciple until chapter 9 of his gospel, so he would certainly need sources to know everything that happened before that. And Matthew would need sources for what happened at Jesus' crucifixion in chapters 26 to 28, since he had fled the scene. In his book, The Case for Christ, Lee Strobel interviewed New Testament scholar Craig Blomberg, and he brought up the same objection. And Blomberg pretty much gave the same answer I just did. He says, quote, "It only makes sense if Mark was indeed basing his account on the recollections of the eyewitness Peter. As you've said yourself, Peter was among the inner circle of Jesus, and so was privy to seeing and hearing things the other disciples didn't, so it would make sense for Matthew, even though he was an eyewitness, to rely on Peter's version of events as transmitted through Mark." End quote. And then Strobel writes, "Yes, I thought to myself, that did make some sense. In fact, an analogy began to form in my own mind from my years as a newspaper reporter. I recall being part of a crowd of journalists that had once cornered the famous Chicago political patriarch, the late Mayor Richard J. Daley, to pepper him with questions about a scandal that was brewing in the police department. He made some remarks before escaping to his limousine. Even though I was an eyewitness to what had taken place, I immediately went to a radio reporter who had been closer to Daley and asked him to play back his tape of what Daley had just said. This way I could make sure I had his words correctly written down. That, I mused, was apparently what Matthew did with Mark. Although Matthew had his own recollections as a disciple, his quest for accuracy prompted him to rely on some material that came directly from Peter in Jesus's inner circle. Quote and end quote. Athanasius writes, "Is there anything you see that you think decreases the probability of New Testament traditional authorship, even if overall it's the most probable explanation?" This is a question you've asked a couple of times now in the course of this series of TikToks on the maximal data argument for Jesus' resurrection. And like I said in a written comment, this is like saying, well, what do you think is the best explanation for why the fingerprints of the defendant are on the murder weapon other than the defendant is guilty of the crime? When the evidence points this strongly in a certain direction, it's hard for me to imagine what other conclusion I should draw. Now, perhaps if all of the evidence were to go away, then maybe the idea that the Gospels were anonymous would be plausible. If all of the evidence that I've cited were to just disappear, then yeah, maybe. Or perhaps more likely, if archaeologists digging in the dirt were to find ancient manuscripts of Christian authors from the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries who were attributing the Gospel of Matthew to maybe Paul or Mary or Barnabas or anyone other than Matthew. Maybe you find some other writings attributing the Gospel of John to Lazarus. I'm sure Richard Bauckham would like that. Um, if we found some contradictory historical writings, which don't exist currently, but maybe if somebody was digging in Israel and they just happened to find like a treasure chest of documents, some of which were written by people saying, no, Matthew didn't write this, it was this other guy. Or maybe if we found ancient extant manuscripts of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that had different titles on them. The manuscript evidence that I cited in the very first TikTok that started this whole series of TikToks, they are all in agreement. This is the gospel according to Matthew. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the gospel according to John, or just John. Variations of ascribing the authorship to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If we discovered ancient manuscripts that created a situation that mirrors the book of Hebrews, because Hebrews is attributed to all sorts of different people too, and sometimes it's just left anonymous. In fact, one church father, I can't remember who said it, but he said, "Who wrote the book of Hebrews? Only God knows." Because there was just so much dispute about who wrote the thing, but there was no dispute like this with the Gospels. But maybe if we found some ancient manuscripts that did attribute the canonical Gospels to different authors, making some conflict, that would make the anonymous gospel theory a lot more plausible. So basically, what would convince me is either better objections than the ones I've surveyed in researching for my article series and podcast series, or evidence that doesn't exist yet, and it may never will. So I've been spending several TikToks defending the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. And over the course of most of these TikToks, I have been responding to a commenter who was pushing back against traditional authorship. His position isn't necessarily that traditional authorship is false. He seems to be more agnostic about it. But you can go back and watch the original video where I defend the case for the resurrection, not using a minimal facts approach for once. um, and I argued that the Gospels are written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that Matthew and John are eyewitnesses, that Matthew the tax collector was with Jesus for 3 years, so was John the fisherman, and Mark got his information from Peter. From then, I looked at the details of their testimony as written in the 4 Gospels, and we saw that they described Jesus. He died, his tomb was empty, he appeared to multiple people on multiple different occasions, having prolonged discussions with them, doing very physical things, like eating fish and inviting his disciples to touch him. And then I went on to give a syllogism formulated by philosopher Lydia McGrew for the the truth of the resurrection based on their testimonies, the eyewitness testimonies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And it went like this. 1. The gospel authors were either lying, mistaken, or telling the truth. 2. The gospel authors are not lying or mistaken. 3. Therefore, they were telling the truth. Unfortunately, we didn't get to spend too much time on the syllogism because we spent a whole lot of time just talking about part 1, traditional authorship. But because like the minimal facts argument, the maximal data argument is a two-stage approach. Establish that the Gospels are reliable, or at least that they were written by eyewitnesses in the short form version of the argument, and then rule out the alternatives to the eyewitnesses either lying or being mistaken. I only got to look at one alternative, but for the mistaken hypothesis, but I think it's the best one, the hallucination theory. But what are the implications? Why is the resurrection of Jesus so important? Well, because if it is true, it establishes the truth of the entire Christian worldview. If Jesus rose from the dead, for one, he claimed to be God. And if Jesus rose from the dead, then that is God putting a stamp of approval on everything Jesus said and did. God would not raise a heretic and a blasphemer. God would not raise Jesus, having claimed to be God, knowing that if he did so, it would lead the disciples and much of Israel and even the pagan world astray. God doesn't want people worshiping a false God. So by raising Jesus from the dead, God the Father put his stamp of approval on everything Jesus said and did. Now you might be wondering, well, where did Jesus claim to be God? Well, in several places, but I'll just mention my favorite place. In Mark chapter 14, verses 60 to 64, we read, quote, Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? I am, said Jesus, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. The high priest tore his clothes. Why do we need any more witnesses? He asked. You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? They all condemned him as worthy of death. End quote. Jesus' response combines Psalm chapter 110, verse 1, and Daniel chapter 7, verses 13, verse 1. In Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 to 14, we read, quote, In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming on the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Now, with regards to the cloud writing language, Michael S. Heiser writes, quote, Throughout the Ugaritic text, Baal is repeatedly called the one who rides the clouds, or the one who mounts the clouds. The description is recognized as an official title of Baal. No angel or lesser being bore the title. As such, everyone in Israel who heard the title associated it with a deity, not a man or an angel. Part of the literary strategy of the Israelite prophets was to take this well-known title and attribute it to Yahweh in some way. Consequently, Yahweh, the God of Israel, bears this descriptive title in several places in the Old Testament. Isaiah chapter 19, verse 1, Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 26, Psalm chapter 68, verse 33, Psalm chapter 104, verse 3. For a faithful Israelite, then, there was only one God who rode on the clouds, Yahweh, end quote. Here's why the Sanhedrin found Jesus' claim blasphemous. One, he claimed to be Daniel's son of man who would A, be given sovereign authority, given authority, glory, and sovereign power, B, would be worshipped by people all over the world, and C, would have a kingdom that would never end. 2, he would come in judgment riding on the clouds. He's the cloud rider. Riding the clouds in judgment is Yahweh's job. 3, he would be seated at the right hand of God. To sit at God's right hand is to sit on God's throne. To sit on God's throne is to claim equality with God. So again, by establishing the historicity of the resurrection, God the Father established his claim. Jesus is the second person of the Trinity. Now, what follows from this? Well, it means that we can put a lot of stock in what Jesus taught. Jesus taught that the Old Testament was the divinely inspired Word of God. Indeed, he was a rabbi. Of course, you have it's a job requirement to believe the Old Testament is the divinely inspired and authoritative Word of God. You can't be a rabbi without it. So, who would be in a better position to know whether or not the Old Testament is divinely inspired and authoritative than God himself? So I believe the Old Testament it's historically accurate, it's trustworthy. I can believe what it says because Jesus says so. You will often hear Christian apologists say the phrase, I don't believe in Jesus because I believe the Bible. I believe the Bible because I believe in Jesus. That is true of me. I believe the Bible because I believe in Jesus, and I believe in Jesus on the basis of good historical evidence. What else? Well, we can believe in the existence of angels and demons because Jesus taught angels and demons existed. We can believe in the historicity of Genesis 1 to 11, assuming that our exegesis leads us to conclude that whoever wrote Genesis 1 to 11, their authorial intent was to take it as at least minimally historical. So, by establishing the resurrection in conjunction with Jesus' divine self-understanding, the Christian worldview is established.